web, and it's definitely the like so much of the ZR not written as thoroughly as it could be, and then when it went from air to MA, which is like a big question. We're figuring that one out. That's what I heard. Your name was, you were on, there's some zoning interpretation. Oh, Julia. Oh, so, understood. I think it was 800 blocks away. Oh, when you were like, yeah. From hand to out. That would be great.
How are you, Joan? I'm good. Hey, good to see you. Oh, this is a great room today. You brought your mail? You just checking your mail. There you go.
For those who are joining us on Zoom, please let me know if you could hear us. Okay, we just weren't talking into the microphones before. The meeting hasn't started yet. When you're ready, just ask me to call roll.
Call roll.
Oh, okay. It just went off. I think we have a loose wire. I don't know how to fix it. But at least we have that one. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Land Use Landmarks Committee meeting. I am going to be calling roll. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, Juki, could you please stop sharing your screen right now? For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, please remember to unmute yourself, acknowledge your name, and then mute yourself again. If you are in the room and you're one of my new board members, I don't recognize your face yet, so please just make sure that you raise your hand when I'm finished with the roll call so I mark your attendance appropriately. Let's start with Diana Gonzalez.
Here.
Thank you. Joan Body. Thank you. Gabino Morales Escamilla. Kenny Guan. Julia Melzer Harris. Thank you. Nicholas Jackson. Thank you. Zachary Jacy. Christina Lem. Paul Mack. Antoinette Martinez. Marilyn Melman. Jamie Nelson. Karen Rolnick. Thank you. Damaris Santiago. Chairperson Julio Pena III. Thank you. You do not have a quorum. We are 3 short. You can.
So this will not be an official meeting, but unless that changes, but we will still go through everything and we can make recommendations that the full community board can then adopt. So there is a path forward today. Right, we have a second meeting coming up, sorry. So. When is it again? Oh, yeah, we do not.
We fully plan to come to that one as well.
Okie dokie, so I guess I'll turn it over to you, Juki.
All right.
No new community board members here today? Okay, great.
Diana. Good evening, everyone. My name is Juki Sai. I work in the Brooklyn office of the Department of City Planning. I'm joined tonight by my colleagues, Jordan and Catherine, also here from the Brooklyn office. They might help me answer some questions. After this presentation, I'll be talking for about 35 minutes. And I just wanted to say, the board requested that we did a couple meetings because this is a big proposal. This one today is going to be a pretty broad overview of what the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity is. And then in the follow-up meeting, which we'll schedule, and we can even work on scheduling that at the end of tonight, or maybe tomorrow, we can follow up with specific questions the board has, as well as some of the proposals that are a little bit more directly applicable to Community Board 7. So again, broad overview that I'm going to go into right now, and then a follow-up meeting where we go into a little bit more detail on some of the specifics as this proposal applies to CB7. So I'm going to share my screen. One sec. And can our folks online just maybe write in the chat that you can see the screen and hear me talking? All right, thank you. So I'm here tonight to present on the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity, a citywide text amendment, and it's the third of 3 that is proposed to change zoning to allow for more housing development. These changes are intended to enable a little more housing in every neighborhood by removing some of the zoning-related barriers to housing growth. City of Yes for Housing Opportunity is a citywide plan that will encourage incremental housing growth over a wide geography. And again, tonight, I'm going to be giving a broad overview, and I will come back again to a follow-up meeting to talk more details specific to Community Board 7. I'm going to go into the proposals, and I'd request that everyone just holds their questions until the end, just so we can get through this, so you have a broad idea of what's going on, and then we can get into specific questions. New York City faces a severe housing shortage. The vacancy rate for rental apartments is historically low, only 1.4%, far below a healthy vacancy rate that would provide New Yorkers with housing options. In Brooklyn, the vacancy rate is 1.27%. Our housing demand is greater than our housing supply, and it's one of the core reasons we believe New Yorkers are experiencing very high housing costs. Over half of New York City renters are rent burdened, meaning they spend over 30% of their monthly income on rent. Not having enough homes is also a direct cause of homelessness. Each night of 2023, over 92,000 homeless New Yorkers slept in shelters, and that included over 33,000 homeless children. Most of New York City's housing was created in the first half of the 20th century. Since that time, housing production has fallen dramatically. That's in part because of zoning that has become increasingly restrictive since 1961. While housing production has decreased, the demand for housing has increased. There are a number of reasons for this. For example, that households are smaller today than they used to be, meaning that even the same amount of people take up more space. What recent housing production has occurred has been limited to only a few neighborhoods. In 2023, 10 community districts produce as much housing as the other 49 combined. When some neighborhoods stop producing housing, that puts additional pressure on the other neighborhoods to produce more and more new housing. The proposals in City of Yes for Housing Opportunity emerge from the goals outlined in Where We Live New York City, the city's Fair Housing Plan. Where We Live NYC was created by the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD, in collaboration with over 250 community organizations. It highlights how the city's housing shortage and affordability crisis has severely limited New Yorkers' housing choices. In a tight housing market, landlords can charge high rents, and existing tenants are vulnerable to tenant harassment, poor housing quality, and displacement pressure as they compete with each other for a limited number of units. When there are few apartments to choose from, renters pay more. In Brooklyn, 52.6% of renters are considered rent burdened. The average New York City household makes about $70,000 a year, but the average two-bedroom apartment in New York City is over $2,700 a month. This means that your average working family would have to spend about half their income on rent to get a home for their family. We believe New York City's dire housing shortage has direct human consequences. These have been underscored in our extended community engagement process. Over the past year, the Department of City Planning has met with over 100 groups, including housing nonprofits, tenants' rights groups, faith-based organizations, and affordable housing providers. Each of these groups was able to share a unique and valuable perspective on the lived experiences resulting from our housing crisis. Many city agencies work on policies and programs that aim to address New Yorkers' housing needs. The Department of City Planning is responsible for the city's zoning. Zoning regulates what can be built on a particular site, both how big the building can be and what uses it can have, residential or commercial, for example. Sometimes zoning includes other things like requirements for income-restricted affordable housing units. But zoning does not fund new housing or directly control what will be built. It only establishes rules for what may be built. How much housing gets built depends on many factors. Other tools the city uses to support good housing outcomes include subsidies or tax incentives to promote income-restricted affordable housing, programs for affordable home ownership, and tenant protections that guarantee New Yorkers' rights. Changing our zoning can respond to these issues by increasing the number and types of homes available in every neighborhood across the city. If each neighborhood adds a little more housing, New York City can add a lot more housing overall without any single neighborhood experiencing dramatic changes or overtaxed infrastructure. This text amendment is the biggest pro-housing change DCP has ever undertaken and would touch the zoning for every single part of the city. In medium and high density zoning districts, the universal affordability preference, UAP, which would allow slightly bigger buildings for affordable housing. And I'm going to get much more into detail on this in a minute. In low density areas, the proposal would allow more missing middle housing or low-rise apartment buildings and provide flexibility for homeowners by allowing them to add accessory dwelling units, known as ADUs, to their homes. Across the city, the proposal would remove residential parking mandates, which are making housing more expensive. There are also a range of smaller proposals, including enabling conversion of non-residential buildings, allowing more small and shared apartments, and allowing for residential campuses to add height-limited buildings. This map shows the low and high density areas in Community Board 7. The medium and high density areas are shown in yellow, and the low density areas are shown in blue. And that would be kind of in the upper right-hand corner, more of the Windsor Terrace area. I want to clarify that when I say low density and medium density, that low density refers to areas where the underlying zoning is R5 and below. This includes R5A, R5B. And then medium and high density districts refers to the areas where the zoning is R5 and above. Again, low density, R5 and below, medium and high density, R5 and above. So moving into the medium and high density areas and the big proposals for that. In our medium and high density areas of New York City, which make up much of CB7, especially in the southern parts, our focus is on creating more opportunities for housing, including affordable housing. To do this, the proposal introduces the Universal Affordability Preference, or UAP. It would allow apartment buildings to be 20% larger, so long as the extra space is occupied by permanently affordable or supportive housing. UAP is modeled after the current rules that allow bigger buildings for affordable senior housing in certain neighborhoods. UAP would allow incremental housing growth in neighborhoods and encourage affordable housing throughout the city rather than concentrating it in a few neighborhoods. This map shows which districts have an existing senior housing preference, and that's shown in the lighter orange areas, and you can see that especially along the avenues in the southern portion of CD7. Through the UAP framework, all forms of affordable and supportive housing would be able to take advantage of higher FARs already provided to affordable senior housing in these districts. Again, that's the light orange areas. However, there are districts that don't have the senior housing preference today, and that's shown in darker orange on the map. In these areas, the proposal would create new FARs, floor area ratio, to enable growth of affordable and supportive housing in every neighborhood. The proposal would also make sure that zoning provides room to build the extra affordable housing required through the universal affordability preference. So there will be limited height increases where it is necessary to make enough room for these affordable homes. UAP would have an affordability requirement of 60% of area median income. Area median income, or AMI, is a measure of affordability established by the federal government. At 60% AMI, or $76,000 roughly, for a family of 3, UAP would serve lower income New Yorkers than the existing voluntary inclusionary housing tool. UAP would replace voluntary inclusionary housing program, but mandatory inclusionary housing, known as MIH, which requires a percentage of the new developments to be income-restricted affordable housing, would continue to exist, and it would be mapped when there are significant increases in residential density or when there's a rezoning. UAP would also serve New Yorkers at even lower income levels through income averaging. Income averaging means that instead of only including homes at the required affordability level, a building can introduce homes at a range of incomes that average to the required affordability. So, for example, a building could meet UAP's 60% AMI affordability level by including a mix of homes at different AMI levels, like 30% AMI, which is roughly $38,000 per family of three, 60% AMI, which again is roughly $76,000 for a family of three, or 90% AMI, which is roughly $115,000 per family of three. And again, a mix can be included as long as the average pencils out to 60% AMI. Through UAP's deeper affordability requirement and the introduction of income averaging, UAP can help to serve the low-income New Yorkers who are most in need of affordable housing. Here's one example of how UAP works. If a church is located in an R6, a church located in an R6 district wants to build affordable housing today, it would get 3.0 FAR, regardless of whether they're developing market rate or affordable housing. This would allow them to build about 35 units. Under UAP, they would get 3.9 FAR, but the additional 0.9 FAR could only be used for affordable housing. If it is, they can build about 10 to 12 more affordable units. 10 to 12 more affordable units may not sound like a lot, but this is functioning at a citywide scale. If every project has a few more affordable units, New York City can add a significant amount of affordable housing, and no single neighborhood will experience drastic changes. This is a rendering of how UAP might play out. Without UAP, the building is built according to the base FAR, and that'd be on the left-hand side, the base FAR for market rate housing. The result is an 8-story building. With UAP, this building can be about 20% bigger, which, for example, translates to an additional 2 stories so long as that extra space is permanently affordable housing. UAP can make a big impact on our housing crisis. In our preliminary calculations, we determined that had UAP been in place since 2014 with tax incentives and public subsidies and full support, an additional 20,000 income-restricted affordable homes could have been created and housed around 50,000 New Yorkers. Mandatory inclusionary housing areas would remain in place and continue to be mapped when there are significant increases in residential density. This proposal would introduce some adjustments, what we believe are improvements to MIH. First, under CHO, MIH option 3, previously known as the deep affordability option, could be applied as a standalone option. Today, it has to be applied as an alternate with MIH options 1 or 2. This would allow future actions to map solely MIH option 3 and ensure deep affordability when it's mapped. Some MIH FARs would also be raised to meet the UAP FARs. For example, R6A currently has an MIH FAR, again, that's floor area ratio of 3.6, which would be raised to 3.9. The options that would remain in place, meaning the same percentages of affordability will continue to be required. Finally, the current MIH program is incompatible with the tools that facilitate affordable home ownership. This proposal would exempt 100% affordable home ownership projects from the rules that prevent them from financially penciling out. Now, I'm going to switch gears to some of the lower density areas. And a reminder that this refers to the areas where zoning districts are R5 and below. This includes R5B, which again is mapped over much of Windsor Terrace. Exclusionary zoning rules have made it virtually impossible to build housing in many low-density neighborhoods, placing additional pressure on high-density parts of the city to produce more housing. This wasn't always the case. Small apartment buildings and 2 to 3 family homes are common in all of New York City's lower density neighborhoods, and were allowed in many places until as recently as the 1990s and early 2000s, when stricter zoning prevented them. City of Yes for Housing Opportunity would reintroduce modest buildings that are more naturally affordable than other types of construction and apartment buildings at scale, in which they can take advantage of existing affordability programs. Together, these changes are intended to allow for the creation of more housing in low-density areas. This slide shows the low-density areas in Community Board 7. Again, you see in blue the low-density areas, which are farther to the north. Our town center proposal aims to create more missing middle housing in low-density areas. Missing middle refers to a category of housing that's modest in scale and often affordable to middle-income residents, a once common type of housing that's not often built in the city anymore. This proposal aims to re-legalize mixed-use apartments or buildings with a ground floor commercial use and a few stories of housing on top. This is a classic New York City building type that exists along many low-density commercial corridors. Overly complex zoning rules make it almost impossible to build new ones. This proposal streamlines zoning rules, including the restrictive limits on floor area and height, so that it is once again feasible to build 2 to 4 stories of housing above a commercial ground floor. So again, housing over a store, like you can kind of see in this graphic here. Our second low-density proposal, or second proposal for missing middle housing, is transit-oriented development. Transit-oriented development would allow for low-rise buildings, 3 to 5 stories, depending on what the existing zoning is, on sites that are near transit and meet specific criteria. First, the site must be in a block within 0.5 miles of the subway or rail station. Second, the lot must be over 5,000 square feet. And finally, the lot must be located on the short end of a block or on a wide street, which zoning defines as being over 75% wide or 75 feet wide. I can explain that more later. Community facilities like faith-based organizations or libraries can also use these rules throughout the city on sites over 5,000 square feet where a community facility space is present. Our transit-oriented development rules would promote missing middle housing while also promoting sustainability by adding housing in areas with good transit access. In the rest of the low-density areas, the proposal aims to give homeowners more flexibility. Under this proposal, a 1 or 2 family home would be allowed to add a small accessory dwelling unit, or ADU, known as an ADU. There are a range of types of ADUs, including backyard cottages, garage conversions, and basement apartments. These small units would provide important housing options for small households, like a young person moving into their own place for the first time, or an elderly resident who wants to age in place. Because of their small size, they would also serve different income levels than a large single-family home. Successful ADU programs in other places, including Austin and Seattle, and the state of Connecticut, show us that these units can give multi-generational families a little more space and help middle-class homeowners with household expenses. The proposal includes rules that would ensure that ADUs are safe. New basement ADUs would not be allowed in the coastal floodplain, and no ADUs would be allowed in special coastal risk districts, areas of our city with the most severe flood risk. Outside of these coastal areas, basement ADUs may be subject to additional regulations or review. And again, all ADUs are still subject to Department of Building review, as well as all other building code laws. The same rule changes that enable ADUs can also help homeowners who don't want to add an ADU, but need more flexibility to adapt or renovate their homes to meet their needs. Our research shows us that many existing buildings are out of compliance, meaning that they're not in line with today's rules. For example, R41 districts, meaning that they're not in line with today's rules. R41 districts are 2-family districts allowing semi-detached buildings like the ones you see on this slide. But buildings like these pre-1961 duplexes could not be constructed today because they have more square footage than is currently allowed or their rear yards are too small. These non-compliances can cause big headaches for homeowners if they need to borrow money from the bank or if they want to make simple changes to their home, like renovating an outdated kitchen. The proposal would fix these rules, which would have dual benefits. First, homeowners of existing buildings wouldn't run into issues when they go to make an alteration to their building because the zoning would better match what's actually on the ground. Second, homeowners would actually be able to build two-family homes in a two-family district or a multifamily home in a multifamily district, when today, the only thing that is feasible is a single-family home. Finally, I'm going to present a little bit on our parking proposals. This proposal, this part of CHO, would make parking optional for new housing everywhere, following the example of many other major cities. Today, New York City requires new housing to include off-street parking, even where it's not needed. These mandates mean less space for housing and increased construction costs, which results in less housing being built. The diagram on the side represents how much parking takes up a lot of space. 2 parking spaces are equivalent to the size of a studio apartment. Building parking itself is also expensive and an obstacle to housing growth, especially affordable housing. This proposal prioritizes housing over parking, and we want to be upfront about that. Parking would still be allowed, and we anticipate that many developers will respond to market needs and continue to provide parking in areas where there is demand. Removing parking mandates can help reduce the cost of housing and construction and enable the development of more homes in each new building. There are a few additional proposals that will provide more housing and a wider range of housing types. First, conversions. Today, outdated rules prevent underused and non-residential buildings, like offices, from converting to housing. For example, many buildings that were constructed after 1961 are located outside of the city's largest office centers and cannot be converted to housing. City of Yes for Housing Opportunity would make it easier for underused non-residential buildings, such as offices, to be converted into housing. To do this, we would make a few changes to adaptive reuse regulations. First, the proposal would expand these regulations citywide to go beyond office districts. That way, a broader range of underused buildings, like vacant schools or former religious buildings, can be converted into housing. Second, the proposal would move the eligibility cutoff date from 1961 or 1977 to 1991. This allows more recently constructed buildings to be converted into housing. Third, the proposal will enable conversions to all types of housing, including supportive housing and shared housing and dorms. As shown in the second image, the proposal would also allow small and shared apartments by eliminating the dwelling unit factor, a measure of the minimum average unit size in areas with good transit access. This would provide more housing opportunities for New Yorkers who want to live alone, but do not have the opportunity to do so today. We currently force too many people who want to live alone to find roommates and occupy family-size units in many parts of the city. Enabling more small and shared units can relieve some of that pressure. Finally, previous development often took place under tower in the park style regulations called height factor. Although DCP has developed a more recent set of regulations for contextual buildings that have height limits and result in better designs, some sites, like NYCHA campuses, can't access these new rules. The proposed changes would allow height-limited infill buildings on sites that would otherwise be forced to develop tall, skinny buildings or nothing at all. The changes I walk through tonight are the most significant proposals in the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. Overall, this text amendment aims to create a little more housing everywhere so that each neighborhood does its part to address our housing needs and a few neighborhoods don't feel the intense pressure they do today. It's not just about more housing, though. It's about more types of housing. Multifamily housing, where it's currently not allowed because of exclusionary zoning, homes of different sizes to meet different people's needs, and crucially, far more affordable and supportive housing. Thanks for listening tonight, and I look forward to questions and comments. And really quickly, before we get into questions and comments, I wanted to note, as we were talking about earlier, we plan to come back for a second presentation to answer questions you may have tonight. There are also a couple sort of matters that I think are worth going over specifically for Community Board 7 that regard the railroad right-of-way. I know that's something that's come up in the past, and there are components of CHO that apply to that. I want to make sure the board is aware of them and knows and can opine on that. And there's also a small tweak to what is allowed in the M1, or proposed tweak to what is allowed in the M11 and M12 districts. And essentially what that is there is currently, and some folks may be familiar, and this may be completely new, in those districts, there's currently an authorization required for any new housing. And what this change would do is on lots where there is existing housing only, it would permit that housing not to require an authorization should it seek to expand. And that's the small change. Happy to share the specific parts of the text on that. And again, we do plan to come back, but I just wanted to, those are pretty in the weeds details of the proposals, but we want to come back and make sure the board is aware of them before we go further in the process. So with that, I just want to make sure everyone is aware that nyc.gov/yes-housing-opportunity is our website. I can share that with anyone here. That contains all of the information on the proposal, including the extended or at this point, the text itself of the proposal, as well as illustrated guides. I've emailed it to Jeremy, I believe, but for more information on the proposal, we encourage anyone to take a look at that. It is all there for the public to see. So with that, we can get into questions, and we might have Jordan and Catherine come up for some help with that. And Jeremy and Diana, I guess I can turn it over to you.
So I'm going to start with questions from board members only, and I'm going to let you all go first, and then I'm going to ask my questions, and then we'll move to the full, we'll get to the everyone can ask questions at the end. So do any board members have questions at this time? Really? Yeah, yeah. Wait. Oh, do we have mics?
Hey, Jiggy. The problem with zoning, obviously, is always a blunt tool, and it's not something that has a lot of nuance to it. And sounds like everything that the city's trying to do is trying to spread this across the city to try and metaphorically bring everything up to a certain level in terms of creating new housing units. But in practice, doing affordable housing not just depends on zoning, it depends on financing, it depends on grants, loans, it depends on a whole other host of different things. So what is the city doing to help increase funding for affordable housing? Because at the end of the day, it only gets built when some developer can find that funding with low-income housing tax credits or other financing vehicles. Just because we can allow the zoning doesn't mean that we're actually going to create it. So how is the city going to do, honestly, what I see as being the other 75% of the deal?
Thanks, John. I think you're absolutely correct on that. As far as I think there's a mix of what the city and state are doing. There was just the 485X, the successor to 421A. I think if we're being completely honest, what we're proposing here is just a small component of what is needed to build more affordable housing in the city. The intent, this is explicitly just a zoning proposal, and we're hoping that zoning does not stand as an impediment. but we do acknowledge that there are other pieces beyond the control, far beyond the control of zoning, that need to fall into place for more housing production to take place. We can try to make sure, like, again, the state level tax exemptions or tax credits. And then sort of there's, we mentioned the rent protections, but as far as the actual production, this is a very zoning specific proposal. And you know, I think we're limited on that side as far as what we can do as our department.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm also a board member. It's similar question. So this point around you don't get affordable housing unless you have policies in place. There's no guarantee with these zoning changes that we will get affordable housing in those areas. That's not part of this proposal. So I think that's just like getting that on the record is John's point. I think the other thing that I'm struck by is like transit oriented development. And I know our neighbors who live in Windsor Terrace struggle with like having buses that have drop off locations where they need them and pickup locations. And there's a constant fight on that. Same with DOB, right? Department of Buildings is like, I don't know the series of problems associated with DOB, but this issue around enforcement and actually making sure that, you know, whatever the zoning policy is, but at the end of the day, like being able to actually go in and confirm are people in a safe living condition or not. So those are things that are beyond the zoning, and those are city issues, right? Transportation, having funding for that, buildings, having enforcement, and not, you know, all the associated issues with Department of Buildings. So again, just the point of informing and educating all of us, right? Like, just because you build it doesn't mean it's affordable. Just because you build it, or just because you change the zoning doesn't mean it's affordable. Just because you change the zoning doesn't mean like now suddenly we have access to buses and the transportation we need. And the same with Department of Buildings and being able to have enforcement issues. So I know that's not what you're solving for, but we just have to keep laying these things out because we are fighting for affordable housing. We're fighting for a lot of these issues. So it's less a question, but just a point. I don't know if you want to react to that, you know.
No, Katie, I appreciate that. And you know, I actually think one thing you sort of highlighted here, and John as well, again, there's a lot needed to build a lot of affordable housing. And I don't think we're not saying this is going to solve that. I do think this is a small piece of it. One point, especially with UAP, is that, you know, nothing beyond, there's no change. Like, I suppose maybe my point with universal affordability preference is that nothing but new income restricted housing is really, for the most part, allowed to be built new. So like, there's no sort of underlying increase in the like allowed by UAP. And I know this is different for the low density neighborhoods, but for the medium and high density neighborhoods, the new housing that is being permitted or that would be permitted under this proposal, that's only income restricted. And again, our hope is that it gets built, and we do understand there's a lot that needs to happen for it to get built.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. To go back to the picture with the UAPs, so it would completely almost get rid of the VIH. So like, would 60% be the minimum, or like, so have you guys ever discussed about going probably even lower? Because 60 is still a little expensive for our neighborhood in Sunset Park. For instance, like we see the library right here with this housing. That's the type of housing I think we should be making. We should be making housing that's really targeting our neighborhood, not so much allowing these developers. Yes, we could give them tax exempts, but that's the thing. You're giving them tax exempts for 30, 40 years, yet they're not living up to that standard. And then you have the homeowners that are angry because they're going to be saying, how come I'm paying property taxes? And then these developers who definitely have the money are constantly not paying taxes. And then you're also putting pressure for the homeowners and then all of that. Not to say, you know, still believe in, you know, more apartments than homes, but I guess what is the way that the city of Yes is really making sure that us people like here in low income communities are not driven out by building these extra two floors or a couple more floors in the community, because at the end of the day, this is also adding gentrification in a neighborhood. You're still getting, yes, you might what is it called? You're still building housing for the future, but you're still displacing residents here in the neighborhood with this new type of an incentive.
Thanks for the question. I think, I guess a couple of things I want to say. As far as the 60% AMI would be, if a building gets built and it utilizes the new universal affordability preference, the sort of the difference between the like market rate portion of the building and then the newly allowed portion, that's all income restricted. And that would be the 60% AMI piece. And, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Have you ever thought of anything going lower than 60?
I think I actually don't know how that number was determined. I think that's sort of what was based off the research the department did. I can see if I have a better answer on exactly that. But one thing I did want to say, you know, one hope we have is that like a building that might build 100% affordable current, like if let's say HPD acquires a site and doesn't rezone it or anything, is building 100% affordable, they will have more floor area to be able to use because they're building like an 100% affordable building. So even, you know, I will say there are, you know, buildings that the city is currently building that are, you know, that HPD is building. I wish there was more money for it. I wish they're building them everywhere that are 100% affordable and they're building according to the underlying zoning. One thing that UAP would do off the bat is make a little bit more area available for them to build. So, and if the building you saw was 100% affordable, it would get that extra 2 floors. So again, at the very least for 100% affordable buildings, we're off the bat giving more floor area. And I know that doesn't perfectly answer your question, and we acknowledge that there are shortcomings in the level of affordability provided everywhere, but this is sort of what we're putting forward and think is sort of appropriate. You want to jump in?
Yeah.
And Jordan's gonna jump in really quick.
And I just wanted to answer your question. You said you asked about AMIs lower than 60%. Yes. So what this proposal has that VIH did not have is income averaging, right? So what that means is that 60%, the affordable units that are built through this proposal have to average at 60% of AMI, but you could build above or below that level as long as 60% is the average. So what we expect is that a lot of the units that will get built through UAP might come out to 30 or 40% of AMI, right? At the same time, there will be some units that come out at like 80 or 90% of AMI as long as it averages at 60%. But what it will allow that the old program didn't allow for is more units to be built specifically targeted at the deep affordability level. Under the old program, you couldn't build those at all.
What's the incentive for the
Yeah, I actually had a question about the income averaging, so that's a good segue. I guess I have 2 questions. The first is, do we have reason to think that developers will take advantage of that rather than just keeping it at 60% across the board? And then my second question is specifically how the averages are calculated. Is it that it needs to average to 60%, or do you sum the total rent divided by the number of units and that has to be 60%? Does that question make sense? Maybe we can start with the first question. I can try to make the second one make sense.
I think so. Broadly, the idea here is applying UAP across all medium and high density neighborhoods in the city. It's a citywide approach. You know, our belief is that some developers will take advantage. I do think it's probably most advantageous in the most expensive parts of the city to build, where unlocking extra floor area where the land value is the highest. You know, again, that's part of the calculation of affordability levels, et cetera. As far as what incents developers to build, I think it's both what is available through the zoning and then a whole other set of factors that John touched on that and Katie as well, and as far as like, what is the market currently? What are the interest rates, cost of construction, building materials, et cetera? There are many components of it. So, we don't have a crystal ball, but I think this is calibrated to at least incent to a degree. But we can't perfectly tell what's going to happen.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. And I think I can phrase my second question better. So, say you had 2 units, one would be 90% AMI, one would be 30% AMI. Would that on its own would satisfy the income averaging, or would you literally average the total income maximums, which I think would entail more lower income units? If that makes sense.
I think I need to like sit down and
I
look
know
at
I'm not a
this,
math
but-
person either.
But that I can note this down, like about income averaging, and be able to more like fully flesh it out.
Great, thanks.
Just to clarify, the average median income, is that a citywide number or by neighborhood?
The area median income, it's regional, the New York region. Yes, it's a very, very imperfect tool. Unfortunately, it is what's required to coordinate affordable housing construction across all levels of government. It's the tool we have, and
Could you tell us what that number is, the area median income for New York City?
it depends on it depends on household size. I will look it up and tell you in a minute.
Yeah, I think that was 60%. I feel like it's closer to 90, but I want to make sure I'm giving you an
Higher than
accurate-
that.
Higher for one person? For 3, okay. We'll keep going with questions.
There's a prize for whoever
Yeah.
gets closest.
Yeah, so next up, we'll hear from our housing chair, Antoinette. Are you there?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. I just have a couple of questions. The first is when we were reviewing this proposal, it had not yet been decided that 60% of AMI would be determined. It was said that less than 80%. So was just wanting to understand a little bit more, how did DCP land on the 60%? When did that happen? And would there be room for that to go lower? And then also, if you all can provide an example of how UAP would actually work in our neighborhood. Will this only apply to new developments, or would existing developments be able to build higher floors? And then can you talk about, how many units are we actually talking about? Like, will developers be able to have 3 additional units, and then one would be 30% AMI, one would be 60, one would be 90 to average up to 60? I think it would just be helpful to put into context how many, what is it that we're actually, talking about in terms of how many new units the zoning text would enable developers to establish.
Thanks, Antoinette. So I want to actually, on the 60% AMI and how that got decided, I want to get back to you in our future meeting on that, just so I have a more succinct answer from our central divisions. But it's a reasonable question, and I hope it's okay if I come back on that one. As far as like how many units and what does it look like, I think it, again, depends on what the underlying zoning is. So in the example we gave, I think an R6 district, I believe in Sunset Park, for example, the Sunset Park portion of Community Board 7 In the mid blocks, it's R6B for the most part, which I think the floor area ratio is probably around three, maybe a little below 3. 2.2. Thank you, Catherine. So Antoinette, what it would allow is, and this would mostly be applied to, I would imagine this is new, although if I think a building wanted to expand under the permitted regulations, there's potential for that. Again, to use UAP, the additional floor area granted has to be income restricted. But if basically the underlying zoning, the UAP is essentially a reaction or sort of a new like to what the R6B district is. It would be a new FAR that is accessible only if you include these affordable units, and it would be 20% more. So depending, that extra 20% of 2.2, that's probably an additional, put it up to 2.4, 2.5 FAR. Again, it's for a small district, it would be a smaller number of units. This would allow, if it was a 10-unit building, an extra 2 units affordable, but maybe more realistically, a 20-unit building, an extra 4 units if they're income restricted. Again, that's really not perfect math. I can, again, try to come back with some examples. But as far as what is allowed, it is very much tied to what the underlying zoning permits. I don't know, Jordan or Catherine, if either of you have anything to add, but I can, again, if it would be helpful, try to come back with some more examples specific to the zoning in Community Board 7.
No, thank you for that. And it helps because it sounds like, I think the person who spoke before me, I got booted off, so I wasn't able to hear your response. But I think their question was really, really important, because what is really going to incentivize developers to build, those extra couple of units? And will this really provide affordable housing in this neighborhood? As Damien had mentioned, 60% AMI, that's very high. Do you all know what the AMI is currently for this district?
I believe, I don't have the exact number offhand. I'm almost certain it is below the citywide AMI and the Brooklyn.
Last I
AMI.
checked, we were about 50% of the
Yeah.
city's AMI, and that was before the past 2 mayors opened all the shelters in our district.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Probably lower.
Right, and then we have one more question from a board member.
Jeremy Kaplan, you can unmute yourself.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, actually, just to clarify, I'm glad it came up. I think Sunset Park, from the statistics that I've seen, we're about at 44 or 45,000 for AMI. So 60 AMI ends up being about, a good $30,000 more. So a $2,000 apartment for a family of 3 that's making 44,000, and there's a lot of families making less than that, is actually very unaffordable. So I think when you look at the context for our neighborhood, and I think it's really important to see that the language that's tied into this and a lot of the imagery as well too is actually, I'm kind of surprised. I saw this from a group called Open New York, and they're sort of a real estate development group that promotes, and they have a lot of similar language, this sort of missing middle, which actually the interesting thing is that New York City, and especially Sunset Park, has plenty of mix of housing. We actually, a lot of this language kind of comes from outside of cities and from suburbs. And so it's not really applicable, this notion, like if you go walk through Sunset Park, most of the housing is the middle housing. This would actually incentivize taking down some of that for new development. And I think the real issue is that there's no nuance in that we build 90-story, like the tallest building in Brooklyn, 90-story skyscraper that has only 25% occupancy and probably was only meant to fit, maybe one floor for each person, so 90 units. But in Sunset Park, we have, 2 to 3 story homes that actually fit 3 to 4 families. So those are not necessarily single family homes. That is this issue that we have to worry about, that we should be getting rid of. Those are actually, affordable 2 to 3 family homes. So I think the context is that this is sort of outside, doesn't really capture a lot of what New York City is, and especially doesn't capture Sunset Park. Maybe some of it is applicable to some of the single family homes, but there's nothing in this proposal. I mean, it mainly comes from a developer-led perspective. Developers are the ones that complain about zoning the most. Most people who live in the neighborhood don't really complain that much about zoning, but developers do. And so I think at the end of the day, the advantages of getting some affordable housing is appealing, but at what cost? And I think that this plan, DCP, has not looked at what this plan would do for land speculation, because anytime that you're allowing higher density, you put much greater pressure on land speculation. And land speculation is a huge part of, cost. And so at the end of the day, this might end up negating and actually creating more displacement than actually creating more affordable housing. So I think we need to see this as, something that I think is kind of misguided. And, like I think John Fontilla said, a blunt tool. It's a tool that I don't think is very precise on creating affordable housing. And especially when you look at the actual numbers for Sunset Park and for, real, middle class neighborhoods, these 60% AMIs are actually creating housing that is not affordable for the existing community. So I think those are the real things that we need to look at when we're discussing, what are these opportunities for housing? Who are they for? And also who devised this plan? Because it feels like it's really missing that New York City is filled with the middle housing. What we're doing is actually we spent a decade of sort of upzoning to destroy the middle housing and basically create anything from 20 to 30 to now monstrosities like 90-story downtown Brooklyn towers that don't serve anybody, that are literally sitting empty and about to be foreclosed on. So that's just my thoughts on this. I think it's important that we look at the real AMI. That AMI comes from New York City and also Westchester region. So these AMI numbers are never going to be really drilled down to meet Sunset Park or low income or moderate income neighborhoods like Sunset Park.
I can respond to that briefly, Jeremy. Yeah, thanks for the question, I guess, and more than the question. I just want to clarify really quickly, the missing middle housing, it's a proposal only for low density districts. So again, that's only that kind of north portion, sorry, I'm pointing up here, that northern portion of the district, which is mostly Windsor Terrace. As far as, again, we understand their shortcomings in universal affordability preference. I do want to stress that we aren't changing in the areas, the medium and high density areas. The proposal is not to change the underlying FAR permitted for market rate development. Again, it's increasing the FARs only if affordable housing is included in that. So yeah, I think we understand there's going to be criticism of the proposal, and there are many types of housing across the city. And again, we believe this is going to increase flexibility to allow a little bit more to be developed in a lot of different places, but that there are going to be some shortcomings and there are serious needs around affordability that, a lot needs to happen for them to be met.
So I have a few hopefully brief questions and then a statement. I note that there are 4 landmark districts in Sunset Park. Can you tell us how those will be affected? If they are not affected, aren't we now creating enclaves that will have higher property values, making them less affordable?
I think for landmark districts, the same protections that apply under current landmark districts apply for what is proposed under City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. As I understand it, under if a district is landmark, there's a whole set of approvals you have to go through if you're going to try to build anything new. Is that right? It's not my expertise. I should learn up a little bit more on it. But again, those LPC designated districts are not changing under this proposal. But what is being mapped or what is being proposed to be mapped would be applied to the whole
But
city.
you might be changing the definition of what is allowed within that zoning. So would that then apply to the landmark districts since their zoning is different?
Like changing the
If you have a landmark district in an R6B, but we're changing now the definition of what's allowed in an R6B, would that then be allowed in the landmark district?
Anything that is currently governed by the LPC would continue to be governed by the LPC.
Okay, if they wanted to build, say, accessory unit in the basement, they'd have to go to LPC.
If the rules of that landmark district would require them to go to LPC in order to do that, they would continue to have to do that.
But to answer your question, Jeremy, would the availability of the ADU would be a citywide thing? And then the additional rules that LPC, the approvals required, are still required. Go ahead, Catherine. Sorry.
Okay, I'll use this for now, thanks. Well, the underlying, these changes in zoning aren't going to allow buildings that are landmarked or in landmark districts to be torn down and redeveloped. They won't allow that. There is a proposal in here for transferable development rights for landmarks, which will expand the areas where landmarks are able to transfer their development rights. So right now it's more limited, kind of just like adjacent buildings. We're expanding that to any building on the block or any building that's across the street from that block. So I think that's something that we can go into more detail in the second session as well. But that's the one change with landmarks, but nothing's changing with what's allowed to be built in landmarks, just word or air rights can be transferred to outside of landmark districts.
This is a voluntary program, am I correct? So I will point out that the voluntary inclusionary housing on 4th and 7th Avenues, because it's voluntary, in the past 15 years, I believe, has produced 15 units of affordable housing. So I'm not sure voluntary is the way to go. I'm guessing this is not a technical term, but it was used in the presentation. Can you tell me what a little bit of housing in each district is? Is it 10 units? Is it 10,000 units?
So Jeremy, to the 2 parts of your question, understood regarding VIH, voluntary inclusionary housing, that is something that has been mapped in Community Board 7 and not produced a ton of new housing. The intent with mapping universal affordability preference citywide is to just completely open up the geography where you can sort of access this new FAR if you build affordable. Again, our theory or the sort of underlying logic is doing it across the city and, believing that that expanded geography will incent and allow for sort of more production of those income restricted units. As far as the amount of units per district, that's something where in our environmental impact statement conducted for this, we have some sort of predictions around and I don't love the numbers on this. It's kind of like per acre anticipated development. I'll bring that to you. I feel like typically the numbers are between, a few hundred to low thousands in specific districts. And that was the build years, is it 2050? 2040 build year. So again, within the next like 15 years or so, but that's something I can make sure to include in our follow-up info. And that's also public as far as what we anticipate in the environmental impact.
And I would anticipate that Windsor Terrace is much more vulnerable because of the lower density there as opposed to the medium and higher density.
So I think a lot of where the environmental impact statement looked at, I want to go and take a look myself as far as if it broke it up by community district or sub-districts like neighborhood tabulation areas. But I don't actually know off the top of my head, so I want to make sure I can comment on that more.
So if we're talking a little bit in every neighborhood, is there a maximum number allowed per neighborhood, maybe by zoning, by community district, and a minimum required of each?
So there's no minimum required anywhere as far as the maximum. I mean, in theory, so New York City is the zoning is like zoned for roughly 11 million people or so at this very moment, and it used to be for 55 million. If every building was built up as tall as the zoning could go, I think it'd be thousands and thousands more units just in this neighborhood if everything was built up, but understanding there are a lot of barriers to actually building things.
I'd like to talk about one of
yeah.
those barriers.
Okay.
That's local infrastructure. We have brownouts every year. We have flooding every year. We have crumbling streets. We have 100-year-old sewer pipes. We have locations that do not have appropriate capacity for water pressure. There's no infrastructure plan that comes along with this. Am I correct?
So as far as an infrastructure plan that's tied explicitly to CHO, no. However, in our planning for this, we've been working quite closely with other city agencies, including DEP, as far as understanding what their planning needs are for the future. DEP is constantly planning like sewer capacity and how to build that out for the city. And again, the intent here with increasing in small numbers citywide is to not overburden one specific area. And that is factored in our environmental impact statement, as well as our work with other city agencies.
I don't know if DEP has the greatest reputation in this community. They were supposed to replace the sewers and water pipes in Fifth Avenue in 1988. We're still waiting for that. They were supposed to replace the sewers in First Avenue in 2005. We're still waiting on that.
Good.
So I'm concerned about the impact on our infrastructure, which the city has not kept up to date on, and then potentially adding thousands of units on top of that.
Understood.
All right, so I guess I just wanted to circle back a little bit. I'm a little confused about the differences between the low rise areas versus the mid-rise areas. Would this 20% add-on be available in places with 3 or 4 story homes?
So it depends on what the underlying zoning district is. So in a lot of Sunset Park around here, you're gonna have, like I was talking about, R6B districts in the middle of the block. And then on the avenues, you'll see for 4th Avenue, for example, a little bit of R8A, a little bit of R7A. In those areas, the UAP would be available, but in districts below R5, so some parts of Windsor Terrace or R5B, UAP is not applicable there.
You mentioned in the ADUs basement dwellings. How is that interacting with what's happening now in terms of state policy and the pilot program for basement dwellings and all that kind of stuff? Because like we don't have the pilot program here.
I don't have a great answer on as far as I can come back on that one. What I will say, I think, especially given, our sort of understanding that there are dangerous basement units, I think it's like really tragic, and we all have seen the dangers of flooding in basement units. One intention here by legalizing them, in doing so, it requires that the Department of Buildings inspects them. And a legalized unit requires a certain amount of inspection for it to be up to building code, which we do believe will ultimately be safer for existing dwelling units, as well as banning them from being built in special coastal flood risk areas. But as far as the actual, like how it syncs up with state programs, I'm gonna have to do some research and get back to you.
Sorry, what was I? So you mentioned converting office buildings to housing, but we don't really have very many office buildings in this district. Was there any talk about converting manufacturing buildings to housing? Or was that excluded?
So yeah, the conversions it's the office conversions again is understood for probably more built up like office areas where the office is no longer needed, especially some of our kind of older aging office districts. As far as conversions there's no kind of changes to the residential permitted in our underlying manufacturing districts, except for the one that I mentioned in the M1D districts, but that's again only pertaining to lots where there's existing residential, but it's not about manufacturing to residential conversions, although there are, private applications that do seek that.
In any of these conversions that are now being allowed, is there an allowance for conversions into homeless shelters?
Like rezonings or?
Yeah, as of right.
So, as far as what is permitted in underlyings, I guess I'm not, like, I know there is a homeless shelter like siting in Sunset. Yeah, there's quite a few. I think as far as what is allowed by the underlying zoning and the special permits for M1 districts, like hotel special permit and M1 and citywide, there are exemptions for sites that are operated by the city or by a nonprofit contracted by the city. As far as CHO interacting with shelter sightings, I don't think there are any changes to like the underlying permission of shelters or not. I think that mostly is in that realm of the M1 special permit as well as the citywide hotel special permit, but that's something I can definitely look into.
I wanted to touch on something your colleague said about the purchase of air rights becoming a little more flexible. How does that then change the zoning that's allowed for the people that are purchasing them? So if I have a property on a block that's all low rises and I buy air rights from everybody down the block, can I then build a 20-story tower?
One point of clarification, the air rights, that's only changing for buildings that are designated landmarks. So nothing's changing like right now with, buildings that aren't designated landmarks. And
Oh, okay.
buy air rights from those. So, yeah.
But
That include buildings in historic districts. Because we do have quite a few of those in South Slope and Windsor Terrace, in South Slope and Sunset Park.
We need to get back and confirm that. Yeah.
But as far as, I think, yeah, we'll get back on that, but I think generally it doesn't change the underlying zoning of what's there, but that's something we want to double check on.
All my questions. Does anyone and from the public have questions? I had a feeling there would be a few. Yeah, whoever's closest to you.
Okay, I'll try not to monopolize, but I have I'm Jay Goldberg and I'm in South Slope. So I'm looking for some context. So as we evolve how we use the city, we clearly evolve how we use the city. Thank you, Joan. So as we evolve how we use the city, what's the long-term goal for housing? Are we trying to house 15 million, 25 million? Are we trying to keep up with job growth? What's the context?
I think in general, we're planning for like the anticipated population growth. I think in somewhere we have a set of numbers on what the anticipated growth is, and we're trying to adjust the zoning to be better able to meet that. That's a good question though, and I want to be able to give you a more fleshed out answer on like what the actual context is and understanding there's a lot more than just zoning that's going to be needed to produce that.
Okay, now will projects that are already in process, so if something is, say, getting ready to enter the ULURP process right now, and City of Yes for Housing Opportunity should pass, does the project in process get a free 20% bump? Or whatever the percentage is for that, for its particular zoning district? Do they get a free bump already in progress and their 13-story building gets to magically be a 15 or 16-story building? No specific examples here.
So what I'll say is that it depends on the building. But what we are mandating in all of our current private applications is disclosure of what those potential changes would be under City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. So that's both in the environmental impact statement or environmental assessment statement, as well as in the land use materials. And so again, what I want to say on that is that there are potential to, in current like rezoned or things undergoing rezonings for CHO to potentially allow more units or bulk or density, but those are things that have to be disclosed in the materials, the land use application materials that will be like open to the public and that will be subject to public review.
Okay, so yes. Now, will City of Yes passing reduce the likelihood of spot rezonings being considered by the Department of City Planning? So if we say we want a little more housing in every neighborhood, and somebody comes in and buys up half a block and says, we want to rezone this to build a 20, 30-story building, and it's going to require some spot rezoning in order to do that, what's the likelihood that you're going to tell these people to go pound sand?
Well, I guess, sorry, go ahead.
I'm putting it close to zero.
Well, I'll start with this, and the Department of City Planning, we don't entertain spot rezonings, because if we did, we would get sued. It's not legal. It's not pursuant to the zoning. We don't pass things that are spot zonings, and we have a legal department in place for just that reason. So I'll start with that.
I'm floored by that, because I have one going on in my neighborhood right now.
Jay, respectfully, again, this is something where we have a legal department and they only, the city would not approve a rezoning or in all likelihood, the Department of City Planning would not certify a spot rezoning, understanding that it is not legal. And again, if there's a dispute in court over that, we understand, but that's simply the nature of our process. As far as whether or not this is gonna, whether or not City of Yes for Housing Opportunity will mean more or less private applications, I think it fully depends. In certain neighborhoods where they use universal affordability preference, we might see less applications for rezonings. But in certain places where a developer thinks they're particularly underzoned or a local community wants a neighborhood study, I think those are absolutely still things that will be happening. And we don't anticipate, again, a complete stoppage of private rezonings or neighborhood studies or anything like that.
Now, I had a question, also a couple questions about UAP. One is, I saw on the slide that UAP is talking about supportive housing with the affordable housing. So I know that for the past few years, the city has required, if you're building 100% affordable housing, that there's a mandate for supportive housing along with that, if it's funded by the city. So does UAP mandate supportive housing where that 20% affordable housing is chosen?
I'm sorry, I'm actually unfamiliar. I don't think there's a requirement for supportive housing with 100% affordable buildings. Is there a law you can cite on that?
I can find that out, but in my most recent meeting with a developer of 100% affordable housing, I was told by that developer that there is a mandate.
If there is, I'm just personally not familiar with it and understand and have worked on developments that are 100% affordable without a supportive housing component. Like that type of develop. Again, I think it's something that is built. I'm happy if you have an example or the law that you want to send to me. I'm happy to take a look at that. But there are buildings, I guess my understanding is that there are 100% affordable buildings that are just residential without a supportive housing component.
Okay, but my question was specifically about UAP.
Okay,
Is
sorry.
there a mandate?
There's no mandate for supportive housing, just income restricted.
Okay, because it's specifically mentioned on that slide. They talked about supportive housing.
I think so. Could supportive housing potentially
qualify towards UAP?
I think it could qualify
Yeah.
towards UAP, but there's no mandate to build supportive housing.
Yeah. But Jay, yeah, I can definitely follow up on that as far as supportive versus income restricted. But broadly speaking, UAP requires income restricted. And it's like, and actually it's a good point of clarification. That broadly, if a building was seeking, to add income restricted units, it would not be required to add supportive housing units as far as to qualify for UAP.
Thank you. Now, a question about dwelling unit factor. What is the limit changing from and what is it changing to? Or is it just being removed?
So for the most part, it is being fully removed. And I think it depends on the neighborhood. There are certain areas where the underlying zoning has 700 square feet. There are certain places where the underlying zoning requires, 1,500 square feet per dwelling unit. But the base of the proposal is removing it citywide.
Okay, so we can,
We gotta move along and give everyone else a chance. Thank
no
you.
problem. That was actually all of my questions.
Okay.
Thank you. I apologize for taking everybody's time.
Let's go to Jesse next.
Hi, I'm Jessie. I live on 7th and 20th and seen most of you before. How's it going? I'm curious, you just mentioned that UAP is not going to be available in districts that have below R6. Can you talk about why that's not the case and what I'm sorry, I missed the first half hour of the presentation, but can you review some of the other ways to increase housing in below R6 districts?
That's a great question. I think part of it has to do with just the number of units that are built on those like much smaller properties and what seems financially feasible to develop on kind of in those like low density areas. The tools really available are, I guess, our town center zoning, which the intent is to change a little bit of the underlying FAR in some of those low density districts, especially where there are a lot more homeowners, but change some of the underlying FAR to bump it up a little bit. In specific areas where there are commercial overlays, the idea is that bumping it up just enough so that it can incent a store with a couple, maybe 2 floors of apartments above it. And, we understand that there is no affordability requirement. Our general kind of the theory behind this is that a little bit more housing produced in this kind of typology, this smaller apartment building typology is naturally a little bit cheaper than a much larger apartment building. And the idea is that producing a little bit more of it, especially in, areas that are like higher property values, can incent a little bit more sort of unit production for that as like, maybe middle and above income, and understanding that there is no affordability requirement for it. But it's mostly to do with tweaking the underlying FARs and the like allowing slightly bigger bulk on certain sites, like especially the transit-oriented ones, but again, they have to fit specific qualifications.
Hi, I'm Julia, also live in the South Slope. I know we talked about this already, but sorry, just bear with me. Can you restate how the UAP would work in the sense of like, why would a developer actually be incentivized if the FAR bonus is 20% to build, 20% of those units that's affordable? They then have to partner with HPD to come up with a term agreement or some program that works for them to build those units, right? Like it's just their own goodwill to do that.
To utilize UAP? Well, if they want to access, the enforcement on the requirement, if they want to access, like if they're going to be going to the Department of Buildings with this larger building that utilizes that FAR, it's a good question about, I guess, the enforcement mechanism, if it comes from HPD or from DOB on this. I might have to go back. But as far as, the goodwill of using it, it's basically like if they want to utilize that additional floor area and they want to build that.
But the only additional is for affordable, right? Whereas I think in the past programs gave them like a 25 or 30% bump for providing 20% of housing. So there's no actual incentive to do the affordable housing because it's 1-for-1.
It is in a lot of UAP, yes. The idea is that it is, yeah, just allowing that additional floor area for let's just say as of right development, that additional floor area does have to be income restricted. And again, a lot of other things have to fall into place for the housing production to really kick in here, including incentives for that kind of housing.
Okay, because, and we've heard from developers, I mean, generally in life, like, as soon as you're doing something with HPD, it takes twice as long and costs twice as much or whatever. So I'm sorry to sound like such a dunce. I'm unclear why, if the bonus is a 1-to-1 with affordable housing, why any developer would want to double their time to develop their site for just like 2 extra stories that, the affordable has to be spread throughout. I'm not quite following the,
No, I think
how it will be successful.
I hear what you're saying. Again, I think our hope in this is mapping it citywide. The idea is, and as Jeremy said, like, we're well aware that VIH did not produce a whole bunch of units in Community District 7. But the theory behind this is the citywide mapping, and the potential for more parts of the city to be able to access this. And then, let's say if this was passed overnight, that unlocks not insignificant amount of FAR for 100% affordable buildings citywide overnight. Catherine, did you? Yeah.
No, thank you. It's a great question. Just to add on, we also see this working in conjunction with state tax incentives, like 45X, and that was recently passed, and that's 80% AMI for, I think it's like 20% of the units. We see this as an opportunity where if you have UAP, a developer may be like, well, I can, put those, we get FAR for those affordable units, but instead of 80% AMI, now this is 60%. So I'll just bring it down while using that tax incentive. So we see that the state tax incentives are an opportunity kind of for why developers would go ahead with UAP. And we also see our lower AMI compared to the state levels as bringing down rents for those units.
Okay. And when you say permanently affordable, is that permanent forever or permanent 30 years?
Permanent forever.
Okay. I saw something in reference to 30 years in the zoning resolution, but
Permanent,
maybe.
permanent.
Okay. And when you do return to Community Board 7, Juki and team, can you give, and I think you will give a more focused presentation on our district, but you said, for example, there's no change to the zoning for market rate development, but I do want to point out that R5B right now has an FAR of 1.35, and the zoning change would change it to 1.5 as of right, with no, fanciful programs associated with that.
I should have said for medium and high density.
Okay. And then, as for everyone's awareness, R6B, if you're doing UAP, a building could go from 55 feet to 65, and R7A could go from 85 feet to 115 feet. And I do want to echo Andrew's point about the speculative development pressures and Jay's about spot zonings, because I guarantee you this district is going to see developers claiming that as the new precedent. We can build up to 11 stories now. I want to do a spot zoning to build 13. I'm saying generally, not application specific, but you will see more speculative development now quoting this UAP new height of 115 feet for R7A. So it would be helpful to see for our district specifically how the zoning characteristics will change.
So I guess, Julia, to the request being, when we come back, have some slightly more specifics on some of the districts in CB7.
Yes,
All right, that's a totally legit.
Okay, and then lastly, I also noticed some changes, just for everyone's awareness, things like changes to rear yard requirements and lot coverage. So today, a building on an interior lot, I think have like 65% lot coverage. The zoning is changing that as of right to 80%. And similarly, changes to rear yard requirements. Rear yards are required to be 30 feet. They're going to be updated to 20 feet. So putting aside the goals of a little more housing in every neighborhood, I just want people to be aware for that the mid-block zoning typology of R6P is R6B, or really what I'll call brownstone Brooklyn. Just a concern that you'll have a lot of like out of character, like deep buildings impacting, these lovely rows of backyards that many of the homes around here have. So that's as a right zoning change. That's going to be citywide changes to lot coverage and rear yards and light and air. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Michelle. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the accessory dwelling units conversions. I've been trying to do some research based on the presentation that you provided and just digging online, and I haven't really been able to find anything very specific about what that conversion program would entail for basement and cellar apartments. Would you be able to speak to that a little bit? And I also, before you answer that, I just want to echo, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, what you were saying. We have a major issue right now in, next to our house where a developer, is building as of right and building out the entire lot because they are, we're in like a 1 and 2 family house, and the entire block is 1 and 2 family houses, and the developer purchased the lot and they're building out the entire lot, which they are able to do as of right because they're within 100 feet from the corner. So they're going to be cutting off all of the light and air into my property and our neighbors' property. And so I'm just echoing the concern for, reducing rear yard setbacks and increased lot coverage, because I think it has a really negative impact on adjacent properties or people who have been there for a long time.
Oh, I'll take that in 2 parts. To be honest, and Jordan or Catherine, I'm not sure if either of you has a lot of familiarity with the ADU kind of conversion programs, or if that's something we should really just come back on. One thing I just want to say is like, in our proposed zoning changes, like we understand that I guess there's really no other way to sort of put it in the sense of creating, like tweaking the zoning to allow more housing is the top priority of this proposal. And there are going to be, with anything that touches across the entire city, there are going to be like, potential changes, and there are going to be side effects of that. And we do understand that. And the thing that is, really guiding this proposal, same with like removing parking mandates, is trying to basically make the zoning resolution a little more flexible to add more housing. And I do want to be blunt about that because that's really at the crux of this. And I don't think it's something we're really running from.
My name is Mike Pesca, and I just wanted to acknowledge, of course, City of Yes exists because there is a necessity. We're either close to the edge of a crisis or at it. And I've been to other meetings like this, and I want to compliment everyone. It seems like we're all good people and we're keeping our heads about us. But of course, I hear so many people saying, hold on with these changes. I'm not sure I totally believe it. So I just want to ask you a few questions, some general and some specific, to see if you could, I'll ask them all at once. One, are we sure that the trades have the capacity, if this all gets passed, to address this? That's a huge issue when we saw some holdups during the pandemic. Two, any thought given to residency requirements? Who are we building for? Are we building for New Yorkers or our neighbors or people who want to come to New York? Three, tell me about the process of passage. Is this an all or nothing thing at this point, or are there opportunities for line items of certain of the items, horse trading? How's that going to work? And the last thing I want to say is more an observation, but it does seem to me that when you allow the 90% threshold, what you're really just doing is allowing developers to just chisel down a little bit the 60%, because they're, a pricing philosophy doesn't dictate that all apartments will be put at market rate. There is certainly profit to be made at apartments that will naturally occur at 90%. And then if you give them credit and let them put apartments on the market for, the less than 60%, because the 90% gives them a little more credit, it's not really doing the exact benefit that we're trying to get it to achieve, if you understand what I'm saying with that point.
I think I do. I'll take that one first, which is, again, in universal affordability preference, the idea is to map it citywide with the hope that there's more building in a lot of different places. The idea with the income averaging is to create more different like types of affordable apartments. If for example, in VIH, every unit, I believe, is 80%. It's like an 80% unit. As one of our earlier board members asked about, it's like, there are a lot of people who can't afford an 80% AMI apartment, for whom a 30% might be affordable. Again, I wish we could produce a lot more of those. But that's the kind of the idea in the averaging, is to create a kind of a diversity of those. If I
Sorry,
can,
just to clarify, but my point was the 80% or 90% unit doesn't have to, there doesn't need to be a government decree, I don't believe, to create or incentivize those apartments, that people would be willing to build those apartments at that price just to make a profit.
Sure. And I guess maybe the point with that is that if you're able to do that, and then you meet your income averaging for the UAP with, all 30 or 40% afford AMI units, that those are then affordable to people who may not be able to otherwise live in that building. I just want to go back really through your other questions. As far as whether or not the building trades are ready to build all these buildings, should all the market conditions be ready? I can't answer for them. I think, that is something where we are not in control of, the unions, the building trades unions. But I think broadly, there's probably an appetite to build. As far as residency requirements, no, there's not. Was born and raised in New York. I would love to live here my whole life, but we're not in the business of requiring residency here, especially if it's just, there are many units that are going to be built potentially as of right. And there's no intended residency requirements in this. As far as the process of passage, this is the beginning of the public review process here. We're here in front of the board like we were for the past text amendments. This will then have a hearing with the City Planning Commission. I believe it's going to go to the Borough Board, the Borough President, City Planning Commission, as well as the City Council. As far as what gets modified at the various points, in the same way that for zoning for economic opportunity went through this whole process, as well as carbon neutrality before that, there are points where modifications happen. Currently, I think there's quite a bit going on at the City Council level as far as modifying zoning for economic opportunity.
Clarify, we cannot modify at this level. We can only make recommendations for modifications.
I will say that for zoning for economic opportunity, the last text amendment, many changes were made by the City Planning Commission in response to community board feedback.
Point number one, there are some developers that lie. We're not going to come here and be naive and believe that all they have. The other thing is with affordable housing, how long is it going to last? Because after 10 years, is everything going to start going up? Also, air rights. I've been in this area since 77, 78. There are people that are selling or leasing now and getting $70,000 a year for air rights. I can't disclose who and where. There's also a lot of homes being bought that are empty. So somebody knows something that we don't know, that they're buying a lot of homes, and if you go by it, they're vacant. And there's certain groups that are buying it. I have a client who has an empty lot, and the developer wants to beat the crap out of me. All I told my client is, if you sell that and they put a 5-story high, you're going to lose your garden. He thought about it. I don't want to lose my garden. I said, it's going to be all shaded. Now this developer is pissed off at me. I can't tell the client to buy or sell, but I can let him know what's happening and what the changes are. And I think people need to live here and see what's going on with the changes. I like to have sun in my backyard and so forth. I have other points, but I know there's other things. And don't we already have affordable housing? It's called NYCHA. So, and then maybe help people own something. Instead of just renting all the time, give people a little pride with owning something. It goes a long way. That's what happened here 300 years ago with America. People went west. They owned property and they took that pride. And I think there's a lot of people in this area that have that pride. And then I know some developers that have very smart ass attitude, and they'll tell him, sue me. I tell you, I'm going to build up to here, and then they do it later on, and they do it higher. They'll pay the penalty, and they just ignore us because they feel they have that control. I don't know why, money-wise or this and that, But again, somebody knows something we don't know when they're buying a lot of properties and they're keeping them vacant. Thank you.
I guess if I could just respond to that really quickly. I think as far as where we get our vacancy rate numbers from, I want to be fully transparent. It's the HPD vacancy survey that's publicly available. We get our numbers from there. That is a survey that the city conducts. And, obviously we hear ideas of other vacant units. What we go off of is what the research the city does that is publicly available, and to my knowledge, the most rigorous study of vacant units in the city. Beyond that, what I did want to say is, like, as far as incentivizing or, potentially allowing more home ownership, there's nothing stopping, if a small business owner wants to build a couple apartments above their store and sell those, this proposal is allowing more flexibility in the zoning for a lot of different kinds of housing. Frankly, if you're not allowing anything to be built, that definitely cuts off opportunities for more home ownership. There's no perfect solution here, but allowing a little bit more to be built inherently potentially allows more home ownership opportunities.
Hello. My name is Catherine Sorrell. I've lived in this neighborhood since 2006 when I could afford to move here. I couldn't move here now. So I feel very lucky to be here, and I would love to preserve or recreate affordable housing in this neighborhood. I echo a lot of the concerns that people have already said. I guess I have 3 questions. The first is, I know that sometimes when housing is built, when new housing is built and it is built taller, it actually has fewer residences than the shorter building that had been there previously. And so I'm wondering what kinds of requirements there are actually providing enough housing in these buildings. The second is the question about residency made me wonder, and how do we know these don't just become Airbnb units or pied-à-terres, or is there some kind of rules for that? And then I came in a little late, so I don't know if I missed it, but when I came in, everything you were showing was a maximum of 5 stories, which is fabulous. A month ago, we went to a presentation, many of us in this room went to a presentation by the Fifth Avenue Committee that was showing the concepts of 10-story buildings and above that would be possible with, as I understood, with this city of yes. So I'm in a state of confusion, wait, were they wrong about what was allowed, or did I come
I
in
can
and
speak to that,
late?
actually. I was there too.
Okay.
Just really quickly, the Fifth Avenue Committee, I believe you're referring to the Brownfield Opportunity Area Study. What they were showing there was just a concept. There's no plans for development. There's no developer. It was basically a study of the area, and they were just giving some ideas of potential development. That said, on that lot, it is currently, I believe, zoned for manufacturing. It's like an M zone. And regardless of what it is, for the building that they were showing, and that wasn't a proposal, that was just a concept, it would require a rezoning. It would not be, possible as of right under City of Yes for housing opportunity. Though I believe it wasn't 100% affordable building. And there's, that was, again, it was a concept. And even what they were showing would not be permitted as of right under this, under City of Yes for housing opportunity. As far as, the residency requirement matters, again, that's not something we're doing. In terms of the Airbnb regulations, that's something that is regulated separate from zoning. What is being currently enforced would not change at all. And I actually believe those laws kind of kicked into effect quite recently and are quite stringent. As far as taller buildings with, potentially fewer residences, one thing I think that is explicit in this proposal is removing the dwelling unit factor. I think we don't want to see, or frankly, I don't want to see like those super tall towers in Central Park where it's a 60-story building and you have 30 or 60 unit, these crazy many millionaire kind of units. That's not what this is, intended to do. But by reducing the dwelling unit factor, it will allow for more small apartments to be built, across the city.
Hi, my name is Adam, from 41st Street. I'm a long-term Sunset Park resident. One concern that I have that I think many of us who live near the park itself would share is that we really enjoy the view in the park, and we want to it would really stink if like a bunch of 50 story high rises came up and started obstructing our beautiful view. And it's very easy now with computers and AI and stuff to simulate like what a 50-story building would look like against the current landscape. So that's just like my big concern. Like I would like more affordable housing. I just wouldn't want really those ginormous Manhattan towers to start blocking our waterfront view.
Your name's Adam. Thanks, Adam. I guess actually, if I could ask a quick question, have you seen a lot of the buildings on like 4th Avenue, like up and down 4th Avenue?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So I guess, what would be allowed, in many parts of the district, those are like the biggest buildings that get built in this district. And, underlying what would be allowed under City of Yes for Housing Opportunity is not much bigger than that. Certainly not with the underlying zoning in this district. There's no ability to build a 50-story building anywhere. But what I did want to say also, as far as buildings that, block the view quarter, that is not, and I'm just being frank here, view quarter matters are not something that is really particularly analyzed in environmental review. However, if there is a rezoning, many buildings in rezonings undergo environmental review. Light and shadows cast on, and I want to be clear here, light and shadows cast on parks and on certain historically landmark sites do get taken into account and analyzed on many of those. So I just wanted to say that.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Gia Sharp. I'm a resident and homeowner. And just two questions. So first, I'm wondering about the focus is, mainly on, it seems like rentals and renting. And to me, if it's going to be permanently permanent and stable for someone, home ownership is really important. And I am wondering if that can be added as a component of this, as a requirement for the developers to access this additional FAR and these affordable units. Why shouldn't they be condos instead of turning, it's basically transferring wealth from, small homeowners that have sold this land, and then it becomes a developer who gets to in perpetuity make money, and that then the people who live there don't ever get to build wealth for themselves. So I'm wondering if that can be added as a component. Secondly, we really would like to have a bigger conversation about basement legalization, just because it seems like there isn't a real coordination with the Department of Buildings, who kind of make it really difficult to legalize when we're going to require a visit, they're going to see everything else and they're going to slap you with a bunch of violations. When you are trying to legalize the basement, because it's the city of yes, and now it becomes no. So we would like, a little bit more cooperation as far as that's concerned. And maybe there's something where there's a correction, leeway or whatever that gives you time to correct these other things, or they can just mind their own freaking business. And if I'm here to legalize my basement, then that's what you focus on. So we need to kind of figure out how to make your proposals actually make sense and they're actually doable. In working with department buildings.
If I could just respond really quickly, I hear what you're saying. As far as the, basement legalization, that's something loud and clear. We want to come back with more information on that. I do think, to be frank and open, we do hear from the other side of things. You guys are legalizing basement apartments. People are going to be in apartments that are dangerous and floodable. And I do think, and sorry, go ahead.
Actually wanted to clarify that
Yeah.
because it also seems like throughout the city, people are misunderstanding basement and cellar.
Okay.
And so a basement is literally like the garden level
Yeah.
of a townhouse.
Mhm,
So
okay.
there's like really no flooding issue. It's really
Okay.
the cellar what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So in legalizing a basement, because it has two egresses and it's not the bottommost floor and there's all these other safety elements that are already in place and that are known by the DOB. It shouldn't trigger something where the DOB, comes and does like a predatory visit and starts, assessing violations. I think that's what I'm saying.
Got it. And again, we'll try to come back with more information. Enforcement is obviously something for many issues we hear about. There are serious issues, over enforcement, under enforcement, et cetera. I do think a lot of this we have to plan with safety in mind as kind of first and foremost. And we do, unfortunately, sometimes that does end up being, with over enforcement and other things swept up, and, it's part of it. As far as homeownership, again, I don't think this is being considered for UAP given the nature of these buildings. It is something I can look into. I do think for our low density proposals, the sort of additional sort of flexibility in the zoning, we do hope incentivizes more potential building and potentially more opportunities for homeownership, and hopefully reducing some of the barriers to income restricted kind of 100% or income restricted home ownership opportunities. But that's something I will do some research on and make sure I come back to touch on in our next presentation.
Hi, my name is Courtney Adrian. I live in Windsor Terrace. I don't have any questions. I just wanted to speak in favor of City of Yes. I would be in favor of it I would love more affordable housing, but honestly, I'd be in favor of this if you let them build to the sky with zero affordability requirements. I think it would create more affordable housing. I hate that I have to stand here and speak in favor of developers right now, because people in rooms like this for decades have been shooting down housing, and now this is where we're at, and this is what I have to do. So I feel like I have to say this. I don't care about your light or your air. I don't care about your light or your air. I don't care about your neighbor's garden. I want a place to live. And I feel a lot of class rage sitting here in this room. On the surface level, it's like a really boring conversation, but it's actually not at all. I'm very angry. So thanks.
Are there any other questions? Number 2 online. Yep.
Jerry Mulvaney, you could unmute yourself. Jerry, you
Jerry.
unmuted yourself and then you muted yourself again. You're unmuted, Jerry. Now you're muted again. Why don't we move on to Chris Huntington? Jerry will try to get back to you. Chris Huntington, you can unmute yourself.
Unmuting right now. Can you hear me?
You.
Great, guys. Thank you very much for taking my question. I have a couple of broad questions. Do you guys have a target population for Brooklyn or New York City or just in general? I mean, the population actually in the city has dipped in the last, since the pandemic. And related to that, do you have any analysis as to why housing prices are so much higher if there's actually a population dip? That's one question. I'll pause there.
Is this Chris? Chris, so as far as, the projected population growth, that's a number, I think Julia was asking about that earlier. Or Jay, sorry. I will have to get back on the actual projected population growth. I do know, generally we're anticipating Brooklyn or the city in general to grow in the coming decades, and it is, I think, something the city hopes to see. Not only is it something, broadly, I think in the spirit of New York City, I know, for our environmentalists in the room, like living near the train in an apartment building is really good for the planet. And we're not running from that, and we want to stress that. As far as what explains housing costs, I do think, it's a really broad question. There are a lot of things that factor into that. A lot of things beyond just zoning, although I do think restrictive zoning is something that, restricts supply and, creates a market where property owners kind of, especially landlords, have a lot of power. That said, the question I do think comes up a lot on, why is it that potentially during COVID, there may not have been the population increase that, or, maybe even a slight decrease. But why is it that housing costs remain the same? And I think one thing that has been seen is new household formation. So a lot of that might be, roommates taking advantage of actually what was a slight change in the market because supply was temporarily not sort of, because there were a few less people in the city during COVID, taking advantage of some of that and people moving out of their parents' house and forming a new household, or moving out from their roommates and forming a new household. There are many, many factors as far as, what creates housing costs that are kind of have to do with global political economy. But I do think
Okay.
one of the more simple ones was household formation.
Can I jump in for a sec?
Sure.
I mean, I appreciate the broad survey of, the metadata, but honestly, if you guys are going to seriously look at a across the board rezoning of New York City, you should have a better idea about how these factors play in. I have one more question, which is kind of a follow-up to previous questions, and that speaks to spot rezoning as it applies to, as it would be affected by City of Yes. And can you speak, you said earlier that, spot rezoning, is subject to legal challenges and so forth. But the fact is that spot rezonings go forward all the time with very little, serious opposition other than, whatever neighborhood people say. The point is, what is from your standpoint, what is the primacy of City of Yes versus spot rezonings that are all around the city right now?
I guess one thing I want to clarify, there's a technical term of a spot rezoning, and then there is a private rezoning application, which could be for a portion of a block, an entire block, whatever.
Well, I'm speaking to be clear and colloquial. I'm talking about developers that come in and propose radical rezonings in an area that has not been, that has not seen that type of zoning, as opposed to City of Yes, which sounds very reasonable, which is every neighborhood does its part.
Okay, understood. No, thank you. And I do think it's an important clarification between those two. So we're just talking about a private rezoning here. I think the reality is that while we do City of Yes for housing opportunity is a citywide proposal, and we do, believe that it is adding flexibility in the zoning that will increase the potential to build. That still does not mean that the zoning sort of that is in place today is perfect to, or, is like completely locked in place, A, but B, necessarily completely appropriate for what is there, or could not handle more density. And again, this is something that goes case by case and through public review. I want to emphasize that all this does not in any way change the public review process for private rezonings, but that yes, City of Yes for housing opportunity is a citywide proposal. However, we do still anticipate private rezonings as well as neighborhood studies.
Okay, so what I'm trying to understand is, given that City of Yes is a citywide proposal backed by the city administration, does the city administration have an opinion about how to effectively pause or squelch spot rezonings while City of Yes is going through?
So, I think, like I was talking about earlier, we're still accepting private rezoning applications and processing them. What does need to be done appropriately is the public review for those rezonings. So again, in the environmental assessment, like the environmental assessment forms, materials, it needs to be disclosed what could potentially be there under City of Yes for housing opportunity. And in the land use application materials, it needs to be disclosed so that the public can see it, opine on it, and that it goes through public review, being disclosed what is possible there. That said, we are, private rezonings are still taking place. And that's, something I think we've been upfront about. And I guess simply put, that's the policy right now.
Okay, and then just to circle back to my first question, and I appreciate your patience and all of the answers you've given this evening. With regard to ultimate population of New York City and density, what I'm hearing you say is that you're pro density, because I certainly understand the environmental efficacy of concentrating people in a given area to an extent. I mean, there are plenty of issues you can get into, but what I'm hearing you say is that the basic thrust of your policy is more population in the 5 boroughs of New York City is a positive, is a good, and should be pursued. Is that a fair characterization of your position?
Yeah, I can take this question. I think our position is that New York is a huge economic and cultural hub, and people are going to move here for jobs and opportunities, like, period, because this is a great place to live and people have been coming here for a long time. And we think that's going to be true whether or not we build sufficient housing. One of the things that motivated us to write this text amendment in particular is, if you look at the ratio of jobs created to housing units created from around 2000 until now, New York City added jobs like gangbusters for about 20 years. And I believe the ratio was that about 1 housing unit was created for every 4 jobs created in New York City. Right. And that did not stop people from taking jobs here. It did not, our housing growth was not especially impressive compared to the early 20th century, but that did not stop jobs from being created here. It did not stop people from moving here. And the result was that you had a lot of high-paying jobs created, a lot of people moving here, and not enough housing units created to absorb that demand. And so it's less a question of what do we want New York City's eventual population to be, because that's not something we think we can control. It's a question of, are we going to build the housing units that we need to accommodate the people who are going to move here in all likelihood, like I said, because jobs will keep being created here and this is a great place to live.
The greatest city in the world, and that's an official policy position.
Thank you. I have Gerald Mulvaney next. Jerry, you can unmute yourself. Jerry?
Hi, Jeremy. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, sorry for the delay in getting through. I live in Windsor Terrace, which you've identified as a low-density area. And I see one of the points raised in your slideshow is ending exclusionary zoning in low-density areas. I live on Prospect Park Southwest, which I believe is R6A. Does this automatically change that zone qualifier or R5A in other areas of this neighborhood?
So yeah, I believe that area on Prospect Park South, if I'm not mistaken, is R5B.
No, this is Prospect Park Southwest.
Oh, South, okay.
Next, between the park, Prospect Park and Greenwood Cemetery, that section.
Okay.
That's the neighborhood.
Gotcha. So I don't think if it is R6A, this wouldn't be changing the underlying zoning. However, universal affordability preference would be available in districts that are, again, R6 and above.
And when I walk around the neighborhood, I don't see a lot of real estate space in this neighborhood. It's small patchwork community. When you identify us as low density, you're looking to increase the population in Windsor Terrace. Is that pretty much the intention?
Well, I guess the idea is that we're trying to allow zoning to make zoning more flexible to allow more units to be built all across the city. It's not just Windsor Terrace, it's really kind of everywhere. We are hoping that the zoning, this provides more flexibility in the zoning for more units to be built to meet the housing need in the city.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. We've reached the end.
All right, is there anything final that you want to say, Juki?
I guess other than thank you for the questions, there's a lot here that we have to sort of take back and come back in our next presentation. But thank you for participating. Thank you to Jeremy and Diana for putting this on. We will look to schedule our next meeting, be able to come back and answer some of these questions. But otherwise, yeah, thanks for coming out. And we're kicking off the public review process. And if anyone needs any further information, there's a lot on our website, but I can also give out my email address. And yeah, happy to field any more questions. So thank you.
All right, and we are adjourned.
Hi, Diana. I just had one quick question before we ended. This is Antoinette. I chair the Housing Committee.
Hi, Antoinette.
Over the weekend, a number of Housing Committee members did some outreach in Sunset Park, flyering, letting folks know about tonight's meeting. And I was just and a question that came from committee members is if the next meeting can be hosted jointly with the Housing Committee.
Yeah, we can definitely discuss that offline. So I don't know if I have your number or not, but I'll try and call you. I'll get your number from Jeremy.
Okay,
So
thank you.
now we're done. All right. Juki, do you know Julia?
Yeah. No, that's okay. Now since we just got all of our new board members, we're about to offer to change committees for other people. I don't know if he's going to wait for that or right. Okay. No problem.
What was your name?
Skip.
Carol, hi, Diana.
How are you? Yeah, I think again, it's harder in Windsor Terrace. I think it's a lot of